Good morning, folks. This is Instructor Gaynor. I'm talking to you from Harrisburg Area Community College. I just wanted to say a few words, a few preliminaries about some logic basics as we're getting started in our logic course. Now, one of the things that you will be introduced to in the first chapter is that we will be transacting in something called arguments. For our purposes, folks, an argument will be writing, linguistics, whatnot, that will be used to try to persuade others to accept a particular point of view, a particular conclusion, a particular thesis. So an argument will have what we are trying to argue. For our textbook purposes, we will be calling it the conclusion that we are trying to draw. Now, unsurprisingly, in order to try to establish our conclusion as reasonable, that is one that other rational people should also hold, we will have a duty to provide supporting reasons. Now, folks, the term that you will want to put in your data banks for these supporting reasons is a word that starts with a P. And I know that now it sounds Sesame Street now. I apologize. The supporting reasons we will be referring to as premises. So for our purposes, if you are asked the question, is the passage that you are reading right now an argument? In order to meet the criteria of being called an argument, you ought to be able to identify the conclusion that the passage is trying to lead you to draw. And it ought to have supporting reasons that we call premises. Now, that was one thing that I wanted to make sure I got across to you. We will be using this word valid or validity throughout this course, particularly early on when we are looking at the mechanics of arguments and assessing them. Now, the reason I want to say a few words about the word valid and validity right now is because it is a word that students frequently get wrong. And I don't entirely blame the student. It's not about laziness necessarily. It is because of the way that the word valid is oftentimes used colloquially, or commonly used, or I should say commonly misused. I sometimes have students say on test questions, and I guess this is all cliche now, but it's, what is it called, facepalm time when I hear this? Because that premise, I think, is valid. I'm like, no, week one we said premises are not valid. Validity is not a measure of the truth value of the premises. Validity is determined by an argument structure. Validity is a structural thing. Now, we will be going into more detail about what constitutes a valid structure and what constitutes an invalid structure. But students frequently get this concept of validity wrong. Validity is not determined by this. It is not a measure of the truth value of the premises. Validity is a measure of the argument structure. Or to put it another way, a valid argument is logically well constructed. Jack, what do you mean by logically well constructed? Well, a short explanation of that might be this. If an argument is logically well constructed, its conclusion will follow necessarily from the premise if the premises are true. A valid argument is one whose conclusion will follow necessarily, provided that the premises are true. Now let me get this straight. If we are to assess whether or not an argument is logically acceptable, generally speaking, when we are talking about what are called deductive arguments, I will talk about those in detail very shortly. If an argument is logically acceptable, it has to meet two criteria. The first assessment that will be made is the structure valid? And if you don't know what valid structures are right now, you're not expected to. That's what we're going to be talking about very shortly. What determines whether or not a structure is valid or not? But the first question we will ask, is the structure of the argument a valid one? If it passes that test, we next call the question, are the premises likely true? No. If it passes this test, the validity test, and if it passes the truth test of the premises, we say that the argument is logically acceptable. And unfortunately, this word is not that highlighted in the textbook, but I want you to know it. If the argument passes these two tests, we say that the argument is a sound argument. Now, here's the word that you'll see for soundness in our textbook. You can use them interchangeably. The other word you will see is cogent or cogency. Now, I hope I did all right here with some of the nuts and bolts that you ought to know right away. But one thing I hope I highlighted is what this concept of validity means, as well as why students frequently get it wrong. And it's because of the way the word valid is colloquially misused. Cheers until later.